Today, after last week's adventure into the world of Star Wars, let's just say we're back to our regularly scheduled program. And by that I mean that we are actually coming back to this book, which you've seen before, some of you have seen before, Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. I have an extra copy. Somebody gave back to me, so I'll put this in the library if anybody is interested in reading it. But we've been using this to sort of guide this year as we discuss climate change. And I wanted to take you back just to the beginning of the year, for those who weren't here. We were talking about how the chapters of this book are organized based on a theory of change known as U theory. And so we're going to put a little image up here on the screen here of U theory, where the first stage of change for U theory is letting go. And so if you're coming down the U, the first stage is sort of letting go. And that's where we began in January, talking about facing the reality of climate change, talking about the complicated nature of hope and letting go of sort of our simplistic hope, the need to grieve, letting go of sort of our denial and grieving, and letting go maybe of the busyness so that we could mind our minds. So if you need a refresher of any of those, this week I clipped out all the sermons from those and put them in a playlist on our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in going back and seeing where we've been this year so far, I encourage you to do that. This Easter season, we're going to continue to make our way around the U shape. So we were started with letting go. The next stage in the U shape is letting be. Okay, so we're moving around, letting go to letting be, which the author, Brian McLaren, calls a place of insight. There we are, a place of insight. And the goal in this stage of letting be is to start to see things differently. We've let go of some of the old. Now we're going to start to see things a little differently in a new light. But before we dive into letting be, I'd like to acknowledge that some of you might be wishing that we were going around the U a little quicker. It's like, it's May, Ruben, and we've only done letting go is kind of what you're thinking. And we get it, climate crisis, bad. Let's stop talking about it and do something about it. Are we ready to start doing something? And if that's how you feel, I'm glad that you feel that same sense of urgency that I do around this issue. But McLaren and others would maybe caution us from going too fast around this U-turn. It's not good to go around a U-turn fast anyways. There's an old African saying, "The times are urgent, let us slow down." And I came upon that saying through the work of Nigerian philosopher Bayo Akomolafe, and he invites us into what he calls a slower urgency. And he does that by asking this important question this morning, which is the question I want us to consider. What if the way we respond to the crisis, so we have this, we know there's a crisis, we want to respond to it, we're going to do it. What if the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis? McLaren explains that like this. He writes, "So far, all or nearly all of our fixes, all of our plans to heal the planet or save the earth use the same logic that got us into this mess." If I was going to understand what that logic is, it would be about that the earth is full of resources for us to utilize, and we are smart and capable, and we're going to innovate, and capitalism, rah, 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 we will get through this. All the plans that we have use that same logic. And he uses renewable energy as an example. He says solar, wind, geothermal, tidal, and other energies are fantastic short-term solutions. But they're also a long-term problem because renewable energy is only partly renewable. Yes, solar panels and wind turbines have amazing advantages over fossil fuels. We've got some solar panels on the roof. Yes, electric cars and heat pumps are indeed breakthrough technologies. Yes, I am all for them in our current emergency, he says. But if we are to decarbonize fast, to shift away from fossil fuels, we're going to need, and fast, massive amounts of copper, aluminum, cobalt, graphite, and manganese, along with rare earth metals, especially lithium. On top of that, we are going to need huge quantities of fossil fuels to mine, transport, and process all these raw materials. When you look at a map, he says, and ask where should we dig the mines to acquire these resources we need to solve our problems, you see that in many cases they are on lands of indigenous people. And you wonder how they will be treated by governments, corporations, and electorates desperate for what they possess. Past history suggests a sad answer. Other resources lie beneath forests and other delicate ecosystems. Again, you wonder how many will be sacrificed for our climate emergency and the solutions to it. In our lust for carbon power, we were happy to externalize costs. Have we learned our lesson, he asks? Or will we externalize even more costs in our desperate need for lithium and copper or rare earth minerals? And then what happens when they run out? Because eventually they will. Of course, you might say, we'll find substitutes. But recalling Akomolafe, will our way of responding to the crisis merely prolong and perpetuate the crisis? The crisis that we need a radically new relationship to the earth, to one another, and to life itself. One of the debates that we had in the book study groups that we're looking at Life After Doom, around this chapter particularly, was whether we thought human beings had the ability to innovate ourselves out of this crisis. And some in the group believed, yes, we are smart, capable human beings. We can do this. Some weren't sure. Some said yes, but thought we'd never get there because we can't ever agree on anything. McLaren, however, would suggest that sure, we might be able to buy ourselves a couple hundred years through human ingenuity, but that ultimately what we'd be doing is just kicking the can down the road and possibly making the crisis worse because we will not have dealt with the real problem of climate change, which isn't fossil fuels, but rather our addiction to clean energy. Addiction to cheap energy is what I mean. Yeah, we don't have an addiction to clean energy yet, but we may have an addiction to clean energy that is cheap, but the same problem. And so this is what he'd help us have us consider. To produce the same amount of energy stored in 1 barrel of oil, a single cyclist, we've got some cyclists here, right? If we put you on an energy generator bike, to produce the energy stored in 1 barrel of oil, you would have to pedal for 40 hours per week for between 5 and 9 years. Think about that. That's the energy in 1 barrel. And think about how cheap 1 barrel of oil is. You could probably buy it for $70. $70 for that much energy. And if you add up the amount of cheap labor the world gains through fossil fuels each year, it would be the equivalent of about 500 billion full-time employees. 500 billion full-time employees. That's how much fossil fuels we use. And that's the equivalent to each of us having 60 servants doing hard labor to make each of our lives easier. Hope you can see just how much then we rely on cheap sources of energy to live our lives. And you could say that we are addicted to it. Cheap energy sources is why the U.S. is taking advantage of Ukraine's vulnerability to Russia to force them into a rare earths mineral deal. It's why the U.S. wants to annex Canada. They want our energy. It's also why Canada wants to build pipelines across our country, despite all the environmental and ethical questions that raises. So in short, McLaren says that fossil fuels are the fentanyl, heroin, or crack of energy sources. And like an addict, we will do all sorts of terrible things to ensure that we get our fix, even if it is to the detriment of our own future and the well-being of others. And if we don't deal with that addiction, it's not going to matter what innovations we come up with in the future, because we will eventually run out. So what do we energy addicts need to do? Well, McLaren suggests that if we are addicted to something, the best approach would be maybe to take a page from groups like Alcoholics Anonymous and their 12-step program. And what is the first step of the 12-step program? It's admitting that we are powerless over our addiction and that our lives have become unmanageable. That's step one. We're addicted to cheap sources of energy, and it's a problem for our world. That's step one. And when you say it like that, when you say it in church, it sounds like a confession, right? And maybe that's an easier way to think about it rather than step one of an AA program. Confession is more of a faith word. We are confessing this morning that we are helpless. And right now I'd like to compare to you step one of the AA program versus that conversation that we were having in our group about maybe we're going to figure things out. We'll innovate. We're smart human beings. We've got resources. We'll do this. Compare that sort of approach to an approach that says we are helpless. You might say the first is more positive, optimistic. Isn't that how we want to live and face this situation? The other is negative, even nihilistic. And that's why I wanted us to read the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee, because it kind of turns that on its head. Jesus says, this parable, he says it's for those who trusted in themselves, right? And he says the Pharisee in the story was confident in his own rightness, happy to continue to do the things the way he'd always done them because he was so much better than other people. But you compare that to the tax collector who's just beating his breast and helplessly asks for God's mercy. Jesus says of the two that it was the tax collector who went home right with God. And so if I were to apply that to our current climate crisis, I would say that our current crisis requires great humility rather than great hubris. Hubris is what got us into this mess. And the reality is that we're trying to solve this crisis using that same hubris. We can do it. We can do it. We'll just get more minerals and more and more and more, and we'll figure this out. And because we've all grown up with and been conditioned by this kind of thinking, we're all helpless in our attempts to solve the climate crisis. And that's a hard pill to swallow. But it's the first insight that we need on this U-turn that we're taking. We need help. There is good news. This is just the first step, is admitting that you have a problem. It's an important step. But it's just the first, because once we have admitted that we are helpless, we can discover a core principle of our faith, which is that while we are weak, God is strong. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthian church, testifying to this truth, saying, "Whenever I am weak, then I am strong. For God's power is made perfect in weakness." And what I think Paul means by this is that once we confess our weaknesses, then and only then are we truly able to rely on God's sufficient grace for our lives. Otherwise, we're just doing it ourselves. God gives us a grace that makes us strong. Paul says to face hardships, persecutions, and yes, even calamities. It might surprise you to discover that AA has its roots in the Christian faith. You might have been able to sense that a bit in the first step, but it's clearly obvious in step 2, which is this. Step 2 is believing that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. A power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. That greater power may go by different names and may take various forms in people's lives, but in this place we understand it to be Jesus Christ. And Jesus is the perfect example of this power in weakness dynamic. Consider that he emptied himself, humbled himself. God coming down here in this place, humbling himself even to the point of death on a cross, so that God might raise him up in great power. Jesus is that greater power that we can turn to in our time of need. But I want to be clear here. That doesn't mean, just because Jesus, God, is our greater power, doesn't mean we just get to sit back and twiddle our thumbs and do nothing, thinking God is going to save us. There's that old joke about the man who lived by a river that was flooding, and his neighbors came by with a Jeep and said, "We're here to rescue you, hop in." And he said, "No thanks, God will save me." So they left. Later, once the water had reached the second floor of his house, a rescue boat came by, and they said, "We're here to rescue you, hop in." He said, "No thanks, God's going to save me." And then later, the water is up to the roof of his house, and a helicopter comes along, and they say, "We're here to rescue you, hop in." He said, "No thanks, God will save me." And then he drowned. And he went to heaven, because he was a faithful guy. And St. Peter was there at the gate, and the man, soaking wet, said, "What happened? I thought God was going to save me." St. Peter said, "You were sent a jeep, a boat, and a helicopter. What more do you want?" What believing in a greater power means is believing that there are jeeps and boats and helicopters out there that God has for us to help us. And even though we are helpless, stuck in a situation of our own making, for which no solution can be found using the same thinking that God is here, even though that's all true, we can trust that God is in this somehow, and that by taking these first 2 steps, admitting our powerlessness and believing there is a greater power, we can believe that there will be a 3rd step and a 4th and a 5th and so on, even if we don't know what those will be yet. And while we wait, to take those steps ourselves. And while we wait for others to take them along with us, while we wait in our helplessness and for the greater power to provide direction for next steps, there is a prayer. AA uses this prayer to help its members along the long road to recovery. You've probably heard it before. It goes something like this. I'll put it up on the screen here. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And that's the prayer that I want to leave you with today as we continue to make this turn around the U. As we remember that sometimes the way we want to solve the crisis is the crisis. And as we take our first two steps together with those three things, serenity and courage and wisdom, let us all be humbled by our powerlessness, but confident that God will reveal next steps for us to take, one step at a time. Amen.